The heavy deadbolt clicked. Austin returned from his 74-day European tour, expecting a tragedy and a $1,500,000 payout. I sat perfectly still in the armchair. The door swung open. Austin stepped inside, casually pocketing his keys. Then he looked up, his face strained of all color. He froze, terrified. I was still breathing. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. 74 days earlier, the trap had been set. I remembered the exact moment the deadbolt turned from the outside that morning. Within seconds, the hum of the refrigerator died. The air conditioning clicked off. The utility lines were severed. Austin had killed the power, shut off the water main, and locked me inside a soundproofed, isolated hillside property. I didn't cry. I didn't waste oxygen asking why the man I married had decided to erase me. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a system failure, and I was an industrial power grid engineer. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. The biological panic that typically sets in when a person is condemned to die was instantly overridden by engineering logic. This is what I call the invisible chain of the survivor. It is that profound psychological shift where you stop viewing yourself as a victim of impending doom and start treating your impending biological death as a simple debugging problem. There is no fear, only variables to control. My failing body, deprived of its critical medication, was just a decaying battery. I needed to optimize its remaining output. I dragged myself across the floor, my muscles already protesting from the acute adrenal insufficiency that Austin knew would kill me without my daily bioidentical steroid therapy. I moved toward the master closet, pushing aside rows of expensive suits that represented Austin's meticulously curated corporate facade. Behind the heavy oak paneling lay the utility chase. Years ago, while designing the villa's electrical blueprint, I had quietly hardwired an isolated microgrid breaker. Austin thought he controlled the entire board, but I had always maintained a backdoor. My fingers, trembling but precise, found the hidden panel. I flipped the heavy switch. Deep beneath the foundation, a subterranean water cistern primed, sending a steady, low-pressure flow of filtered water through a concealed bypass line. The soft hum of the secondary solar array kicked in, bypassing the main grid Austin had sabotaged. In the dark, a small LED light blinked green. I reached into the hidden compartment and pulled out a solar-powered satellite phone I had secured there during the initial construction phase. It was fully charged. Austin believed he had executed a flawless disconnection, leaving me to quietly expire in the dark. He wasn't shocked by what he'd done, and soon he would be shocked that I had stopped playing along. I had been the silent investor in our version of family, footing the bill for a subscription that had just expired. Now it was time to close the account. I rationed a sip of the newly primed well water, feeling the cool liquid coat my dry throat. The house was a fortress, and he had intended it to be my tomb. But a tomb is just an unpowered room, and I controlled the grid. I leaned my head against the cool drywall of the closet, measuring my breaths to conserve energy. Every second that passed was another calculation, another entry in a rapidly evolving ledger of survival. He had audited my life, but I was about to audit his. While I lay on the cold subfloor rationing sips of the subterranean well water, my mind cataloged the precise mechanics of Austin's trap. I required daily bioidentical steroid therapy to manage my acute adrenal insufficiency. Without those vials, my body would enter a fatal shock within a matter of days. Austin knew the exact timeline of my biological collapse. He had mapped out my death with the same cold procedural efficiency he used to evaluate hedge fund risks. I did not feel heartbroken. I felt like an auditor reviewing a fraudulent ledger. Love, I now realized, had merely been a contract, and I had been funding the entire operation. The financial breadcrumbs had been laid out perfectly over the preceding months. I traced them back in my mind, linking his behavioral anomalies to hard banking data. Austin had drained $28,000 from our stealth joint account, an account I had seeded with patent royalties to finance his Mediterranean tour. He had framed the 74-day European trip as a necessary corporate sabbatical to secure overseas investors. In reality, it was an alibi, funded by my own capital. I was paying for the vacation he would use to establish plausible deniability while I starved to death in our custom-built villa. But the vacation was merely an operational expense. The true revenue stream was much larger. Exactly 6 weeks before my official medical diagnosis, Austin had quietly restructured my life insurance. He doubled the death benefit to $1,500,000 and seamlessly integrated a no-wait accidental death rider into the fine print, entirely bypassing the provider security checks by forging my digital authorizations while I slept. He had recognized the symptoms of my failing health before the doctors did, leveraging my impending vulnerability into a high-yield derivative. It was not a crime of passion. It was a carefully hedged bet against my survival. I lay there in the dark, calculating the sheer audacity of his timeline. He had manufactured a scenario where natural causes would perfectly mask calculated abandonment. The isolation of the house, the severed utilities, the hidden medication, every element was a line item designed to guarantee the $1,500,000 payout upon his return. I didn't ask why he no longer loved me. The balance sheet made his motivations glaringly obvious. The family affection I thought we shared was nothing but a business transaction, a long-term investment strategy that had finally reached maturity. As the chilling reality of his blueprint crystallized in my mind, my breathing remained perfectly steady. He had assumed my illness would render me weak, panicked, and incapable of outmaneuvering his design. But illness does not erase intelligence. It sharpens it. I continued to sip the cold water, mentally drafting the counter strategy. He wanted to collect on my death, but I was preparing to liquidate his entire life. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. The cold floor beneath me served as a grounding mechanism. I visualized the insurance policy documents, the banking transfers, and the flight itineraries. Every piece of data was a weapon I would forge in this dark, silent house. I was the architect of the microgrid keeping me alive, and I would be the architect of his total ruin. He had locked the deadbolt, but he had left me with all the keys. I powered up the satellite phone and dialed emergency dispatch. The connection was crystal clear, but the protocol immediately stalled. When I stated my address, the dispatcher hesitated, her keystrokes audible over the line. She informed me there was already an active welfare record attached to my profile. A documented history of instability had been pre-planted as a caution flag in the local police dispatch system, flagging my calls as potential psychiatric episodes rather than genuine emergencies. I ended the call. They had insulated the perimeter, not just with physical locks, but with institutional firewalls. This is what I refer to as the trap of normalizing cruelty. High-functioning individuals often fall into this snare because we are conditioned to tolerate micro-trespassing. Before the physical trap ever snaps shut, covert narcissistic encroachment tests our boundaries. They borrow a little money. They isolate us from a few friends. They quietly rewrite our medical narratives. We rationalize these minor boundary violations as temporary lapses in judgment or typical family friction. We normalize the subtle cruelty until the infrastructure of our independence is completely dismantled. By the time you realize the house is a cage, they hold the deed and the diagnosis. Despite the bureaucratic stall, the satellite signal pinged my location. Responding officer Marcus Stone, a crimes against persons investigator who did not ignore anomalies, breached the front door on the very second day of my captivity, just hours before my body succumbed to fatal adrenal shock. We then spent the next 72 days letting Austin believe his plan was working flawlessly, secretly gathering evidence while he vacationed. The tactical extraction was a blur of medical personnel and blinding lights. I woke up in the intensive care unit, connected to a labyrinth of monitors. I was alive, but the assault on my identity was just beginning to surface. Dr. Kendra Wallace, the lead endocrinologist, stood by my bed with a tablet in hand. She immediately filed mandatory adult protective services reports after evaluating my physical state. But the clinical data she uncovered next was the true revelation. Dr. Wallace had accessed my shared electronic health record network and found a forged psychiatric collateral note. It had been uploaded 14 months earlier by Jacqueline, my mother-in-law, and a former healthcare risk management director. Jacqueline had utilized her institutional access to fabricate a detailed, entirely fictional history of my mental health. The note formally branded me as a patient prone to severe psychosomatic self-harm. She had systematically poisoned the well, ensuring that if I ever cried for help, the medical and legal communities would dismiss me as a delusional hazard to myself. It was a masterclass in institutional gaslighting. Jacqueline and Austin had worked in tandem. Austin laid the physical snare, and his mother laid the bureaucratic one. They had spent 14 months laying the groundwork for a seamless execution, anticipating every possible variable except one, my resilience. Lying in the hospital bed, feeling the synthetic steroids stabilize my failing adrenal glands, I analyzed their forgery. They had assumed I would break under the weight of their fabricated reality. Instead, their forged documents were simply more evidence, meticulously cataloged and ready to be weaponized. I looked at Dr. Wallace, my expression entirely devoid of panic or sorrow. The intravenous fluids were doing their job, flushing the weakness from my system. The mother and son thought they were apex predators manipulating a broken system, but they had merely handed me the exact blueprints of their conspiracy. I refused to play the role of the passive victim. There would be no tearful testimonies or dramatic displays of grief. From the sterile confines of my hospital recovery room, I initiated the forensic counterstrike. I summoned Detective Stone and Hannah Vance, a ruthless civil litigation and vulnerable adult protection attorney. When they arrived, I did not offer them a tragedy. I offered them administrator credentials. I opened my laptop and granted them direct access to the villa's optical camera cloud servers. Years ago, when upgrading the estate's climate control, I had personally installed custom smart thermostat housings. What Austin never noticed, because he lacked the technical comprehension to understand the infrastructure he lived in, was that I had integrated high-definition optical lenses into those digital displays. The house was not just a fortress, it was a panopticon, and I was the unseen observer. The cloud servers held terabytes of pristine, time-stamped footage. Hannah Vance and Detective Stone watched the monitors in absolute silence. The video logs laid bare the clinical reality of the conspiracy. We watched Austin meticulously packing away my bioidentical hormone vials, his face devoid of hesitation as he condemned me to a biological countdown. He moved with the precision of a clerk organizing a filing cabinet. Later in the timeline, the kitchen island cameras captured Jacqueline. The former healthcare director was sitting under the pendant lights, calmly reviewing the fine print of my $1,500,000 life insurance clauses while sipping her morning coffee. As the digital evidence compiled, Hannah's forensic team began processing the data. They weren't criminal masterminds, they were just arrogant. They had assumed their victim was as technologically illiterate as they were. Watching the footage, I felt no anger, only a profound sense of validation. The betrayal was purely transactional. My family affection had been a subscription service, and I was looking at the exact moment they decided to cancel my account to liquidate the assets. We have them, Detective Stone stated, closing his notebook. We have the initial deposit. I corrected him, my voice flat and authoritative. Now we audit the rest of the ledger. Austin and Jacqueline had spent months constructing a reality where I was weak, unstable, and destined to die quietly. They had no idea that I had digitized their entire conspiracy, trapping their treason in high-definition video stored safely off-site. The trap had failed, and the vault was wide open. I closed the laptop, letting the soft click echo in the quiet hospital room. The footage was irrefutable. They had treated my life like a disposable commodity. Now, I was going to legally and financially dismantle every single thing they valued. The financial investigation provided the definitive kill shot. Leonard Vance, a forensic financial auditor, teamed up with Dominic Foster, a digital forensics and dark web metadata analyst. They arrived at my hospital suite 2 days later, carrying encrypted drives that contained the true depths of Austin's depravity. The attempted murder wasn't simply about cashing in a life insurance policy. It was a desperate maneuver to plug a catastrophic financial hemorrhage. Leonard laid the banking schematics across my overbed table. Our $2 million Sedona villa, the architectural marvel I had funded almost entirely with 80% of the capital sourced directly from my commercial microgrid patents, was drowning in debt. Austin had secretly encumbered the property with a series of fraudulent secondary liens. He had forged my signature across multiple digital lending platforms, siphoning massive amounts of equity out of the estate while I was busy engineering power systems. Dominic Foster cross-referenced the offshore wire transfers with metadata pulled from Austin's encrypted European communications. The narrative shifted from simple greed to spectacular incompetence. Austin, the brilliant hedge fund risk analyst, had suffered catastrophic derivative gambling losses in unregulated European markets. He had leveraged our home to cover his mounting debts to aggressive overseas creditors, and he had lost every single dime. The math was brutally simple. His illicit debts were rapidly approaching the estate's total value. If he divorced me, the financial discovery phase would expose his fraud, resulting in his immediate imprisonment and total financial ruin. But if I died from a tragically documented pre-existing medical condition, the $1,500,000 life insurance payout would clear his gambling debts entirely. Furthermore, he planned to use a portion of that payout to secretly clear the fraudulent liens, allowing him to inherit the villa free and clear and liquidate the remaining assets. The murder plot was a cold, calculated restructuring strategy designed to eliminate both the spouse and the debt in a single, devastating stroke. I looked at the spreadsheets, tracking the flow of my patent money into the void of his European gambling accounts. Any lingering trace of empathy I might have held for the man I married evaporated instantly. He wasn't a partner who had lost his way. He was a parasite who had fed on my intellect and labor until the host was nearly dead. The total elimination of my empathy was liberating. He bet the house on my death, I said to Leonard, tracing a finger over the fraudulent lien documents. He bet his life on it, Leonard corrected softly. And he lost, I replied, my voice devoid of any emotion. The financial forensics transformed a domestic attempted murder into a federal wire fraud and money laundering conspiracy. Austin had engineered a perfect storm of financial ruin, assuming the evidence would die with me on the subfloor of our closet. Instead, he had handed me a fully audited map to his destruction. The silent investor was taking over the board. I authorized Hannah Vance to freeze every domestic and international account linked to his name. Let the creditors realize their payout was gone. The balance sheet was finalized. Austin had treated my survival as a liability. It was time to collect. 74 days after he turned the deadbolt, Austin returned to America expecting to claim his inheritance. Flight 408 touched down at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport right on schedule. As Austin and Jacqueline strolled down the jet bridge, radiating the relaxed confidence of successful conspirators, their reality abruptly fractured. They were met directly at Gate B12 by armed Customs and Border Protection officers, flanked by Detective Stone and a contingent of the Phoenix Police Department. There were no dramatic speeches. The arrests were executed with the same cold procedural efficiency they had shown me. They were transported to separate interrogation rooms at the downtown precinct, while Detective Stone initiated the criminal interrogation, armed with the evidence my legal team had provided. Initially, they maintained a unified, arrogant front. They demanded lawyers, cited my pre-planted psychiatric history, and feigned outrage at the accusations. They assumed the burden of proof lay buried in a he said, she said domestic dispute. They did not anticipate a fully weaponized data vault. The power flip climax occurred in the sterile interrogation room. Dominic Foster set his laptop on the metal table and projected the optical camera footage of Austin packing my hormone vials. But the footage was only the opening salvo. Dominic then presented the server logs he had extracted from the hospital's internal network. The digital metadata proved unequivocally that Jacqueline had downloaded the specific medical forgery templates 14 months in advance. The timestamp data destroyed their narrative of a sudden psychiatric episode. It established premeditated, capital attempted murder. As the digital footprint of their conspiracy blanketed the walls of the room, their unified front shattered completely. The clinical sociopathy that had allowed Austin to leave me to die evaporated the moment he faced federal prison. Faced with an avalanche of insurmountable evidence and the threat of consecutive life sentences for attempted capital murder and wire fraud, the hedge fund analyst did the only math that mattered. Austin broke. He wept uncontrollably, his carefully manicured facade dissolving into pathetic, gasping sobs. Without a second of hesitation, he turned on the woman who had helped him orchestrate the entire plot. He blamed Jacqueline for the medical forgery, offering a full, recorded confession detailing her involvement to save himself. He traded his own mother for a 14-year plea deal. I watched the live feed of his confession from a remote viewing room. My heart rate did not elevate. My hands did not shake. They weren't shocked by what they had done. They were completely paralyzed by the realization that I had out-engineered them. I watched the man I once loved weep like a child, bargaining away his mother's freedom to shave years off his own sentence. I felt absolutely nothing but the cold satisfaction of a balanced ledger. The transaction was complete, and their accounts were permanently closed. The detectives finalized the paperwork while Jacqueline sat in the adjacent room, staring blankly at the wall as she realized her son had sold her to the prosecutors. Their institutional arrogance had been their undoing. They believed they could manipulate the legal and medical systems to erase me, but they had merely built their own prison. The checkmate was absolute. I turned away from the monitors and walked out into the Arizona sun. The aftermath was swift and absolute. Civil forfeiture statutes stripped Austin and Jacqueline of every dime they possessed. The criminal courts finalized their sentences, locking them away in federal facilities for decades where their manipulations held absolutely no currency or influence. The legal stripping was clinical, leaving them as bankrupt in assets as they were in morality. The $1,500,000 life insurance policy was instantly voided under the Slayer rule, ensuring Austin would never see a fraction of the payout he had banked on. I took full possession of the Sedona villa, immediately listing the heavily mortgaged property for sale. The equity that remained after unwinding Austin's fraudulent liens became the seed capital for something far more permanent. This is the justice of the planter. Punitive revenge focuses solely on destroying the enemy, leaving you standing in the ashes of your own past. True architectural justice requires taking the forfeited assets of the corrupt and redirecting them into protective infrastructure for the vulnerable. I used the remaining capital from the estate, along with my ongoing microgrid patent royalties, to endow a high-tech legal advocacy foundation. We provide digital forensics and legal representation for chronically ill women trapped in financially and medically abusive relationships. We ensure no one else is ever silenced by forged psychiatric evaluations or weaponized isolation. The foundation rapidly grew, intercepting systemic abuse before the physical traps could snap shut on other victims. It was deeply satisfying to watch my survival bloom into a shield for others. A year later, I sat in the sunlit office of my newly built, completely autonomous off-grid home. The architecture was entirely mine, powered by systems I designed, secured by firewalls I wrote. Resting quietly on the corner of my mahogany desk was the dead satellite phone, the exact device that had tethered me to life when I was left to die in the dark. I keep it there as a permanent reminder of the most profound truth I have ever learned. Safety is never a promise given to you by another human being. It is the unglamorous, unyielding infrastructure you engineer for yourself. I've come to realize that surviving betrayal isn't about hardening your heart forever. It's about learning exactly where to lay the foundations of your trust. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person, and it certainly doesn't require letting them back into your life or minimizing what they did. Sometimes forgiveness is just the quiet, internal release of a burden you were never meant to carry, and the only way to truly set yourself free. I look out over the vast Arizona desert, breathing in the warm, healing air, knowing with absolute certainty that my life is entirely my own. If this story reminded you of the power of trusting your own instincts and building your own safety, share it with someone who needs strength today. Hit subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and remember, never let anyone else hold the only key to your door.